Hello, my friends and fellow travelers. My name is Pierce. This is my channel, Tales from the Road. If you're a return subscriber, welcome back. If you're a new subscriber, welcome to the Tales from the Road travel guide series. In this video, I'm going to tell you about a country that I am really passionate about. A culture that blew my mind. A culture that's ancient and unique and unlike basically anywhere else on the world. The country we're going to talk about, of course, is Georgia. Not Georgia the state, but the Georgia of the Caucasus. Sakartvelo, the land of mountains, of ancient everything, and just such a unique place on the planet. In this video, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know before you go. I'm going to give you some real talk. I'm going to tell you like my real experience and why this place is so damn cool so that you can fall in love with it just like I did. If that sounds good, let's get after the travel content. Come on, guys. As we always do with these videos, let's do a little historical and geographic background before we get into the practical information about traveling to Georgia. And if you haven't liked this video yet or aren't subscribed to Tales from the Road, this is an awesome time to do that. Let's talk geographics. So first off, where is Georgia located? Georgia is in a very diverse, ethnically interesting part of the world called the Caucasus or Caucasus, depending on your pronunciation. In Russian, it's also called the Kavkaz. So I know people roast me for my pronunciation of this region. I say Caucasus, so we're all going to have to deal with it. It's a very famous mountain range, and because it's so mountainous, lots of different ethnic groups have inhabited this region with very different cultures because they weren't always able to easily communicate with each other. Georgia sits just below Russia, and there are some break-off, let's call them regions of Georgia, which sometimes Georgia includes, sometimes Georgia doesn't include. To the north of Georgia, you'll find Russia, of course. You'll find South Ossetia, which is a break-off region. You'll find Abkhazia, which is another break-off region. In Georgia, they include those regions, although other countries see them as independent. I don't really want to get into it, but that's what's to north of Georgia. To east, you have the country of Azerbaijan, a Turkic country, very similar to Turkey, which is to the west of Georgia, like southwest. And then to the south, you have the landlocked nation of Armenia. A very conflicted, very interesting area of the world, all completely different cultures, and Georgia sits smack dab in the middle of all of that. I think the general historical background that a person needs to know before they go to Georgia is just that Georgia has been conquered and in the middle of many different empires for like thousands of years, specifically sitting in between Persia or Iran to the east, Russia to the north, and the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, to the west. The thing is that's really unique about Georgia is Georgia has held on to their Georgianness, their specific language, their specific sort of vibe, their specific culture, and specifically their Christian religion. They're one of the oldest Christian kingdoms in the world, like directly from the time of Jesus, like one of the first ones. And they managed to hold on to this with all these people conquering them over the years. They were part of the Ottoman Empire, so you'll see a lot of Ottoman influences. They were influenced a lot from Persia, so you see a lot of Persian type of food culture and spices and maybe even some words that fell into Georgian. And then, of course, they were a Soviet republic for 80 years, so they were also Russified. There's a lot of Russian culture that's come into Georgia. And after all of that, they finally have their independence, and they managed to retain this beautiful, specific culture that is specific music, specific dance that's like very part of their, like they have this culture that you just don't find anywhere else. And it's so unique that it lasted through these thousands of years of people trying to subject them to other cultures. And I think that's what makes the Georgianness of Georgia so very special. So now that you know a little bit about Georgia, let's get into the practical information. First up, we're going to talk visas. And Georgia is one of the coolest places for Americans because you get visa-free entrance to Georgia if you visit for one full calendar year. There's very few places like this in the world. So if you're a digital nomad and you want to work online and you want to go to Georgia as a tourist without really registering, one of the easiest, most friendly countries for Americans to work and maybe make it a base of their life. I would have really liked to do my digital nomad life in Georgia, but unfortunately I caught it in the middle of COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which of course, really, because Georgia is a border state to Russia and because COVID obviously affected everywhere around the world, made it a very complex place to sort of like put yourself in the middle of. So I didn't do it, but if I had the opportunity again today and it was easy, I would definitely put it on my top 5 list to be a digital nomad, and certainly one of the top 10, 15 countries in the world that are so specific and worth visiting for all Americans. Super recommended. Money. So when you're in Georgia, you're going to use the Georgian lari, and the laris trade something like 3 lari to $1. When I went, which was almost 5 years ago, Georgia was a very cash-based society. I think modernity was coming to them because the post-Soviet Union countries, they're sort of building themselves back up economically, because a lot of the money that was especially in these smaller Soviet like satellite states all came from Moscow. So basically in the early 90s when the Soviet Union fell, a lot of these countries had to completely rebuild their economy because they didn't have the sort of funding and also just the manpower to get the job done, as a lot of Russians used to come and work in these various satellite states of the USSR as well. So when I was there, Georgia was quite cheap. It was a good deal. We can say everything was reasonably priced. And when you're traveling, it would of course be much cheaper than traveling to Europe. Definitely cheaper than traveling to Azerbaijan, which has gotten quite riche these days. But there are, apparently in the last 2 to 3 years, Georgia has gotten much more expensive, notably the larger cities of Georgia. And the reason for this is because many Russians who wanted to leave Russia for any type of reason, I'm not going to say necessarily why they left, but Russia and Georgia have an open border. Many Russians, millions of Russians apparently, fled to Georgia, and many basically started to rebuild their lives there because that was sort of an exit point for those that wanted to leave Russia because of the political situation, which means that houses, apartments, Airbnbs, hotels, and then also goods and services got a lot more expensive because the Russians that were able to leave Russia typically had money. So that means that renting in Tbilisi used to be quite cheap 5 years ago. Today, it's not as cheap as it was. You could probably find an Airbnb in the past for like $400, $500 a month. Now it's probably, in the low thousands, although apparently now a lot of the Russians have left. They've overstayed their 1-year visa, so they've moved on. So that means the prices are trying to normalize, but it definitely had a big impact on the country. Also, Georgia has a historically very anti-Russian stance since there was actually a war fought between Georgia and Russia in the end of the 2008-2009 era. So that means that Georgia, being a border state with Russia and then obviously dealing with different embargoes and also trying to be very close to the European Union, means that things have just gotten more expensive in Georgia for everybody. Is it the richest country in the world? No. Are things cheap in comparison to the Western world or Singapore or Japan? Yes, but Georgia is not as good a deal as it once was. That's what I'll say. Transportation. With regards to getting to Georgia, there are a couple different ways. If you're flying from the US, realistically, it is just very, very far. The thing is, from Europe, from like mainland Europe, it's another 4 hours to the Caucasus region. And if you're flying directly from the US, you're definitely going to have to stop in some sort of intermediary European airport like Frankfurt or London or Paris or something. There are definitely direct flights that go to Georgia from Europe, so that's the good news, but those flights are long, easily 4 hours from Central Europe and then another like 10 hours to get to Europe from where you are in the United States. It's pretty far. When you fly into Georgia, you're going to have a couple options. You can fly to the capital city, Tbilisi, which of course I'm going to say wrong and people are going to roast me about it, but that's fine. That's how we say it in English, Tbilisi. You can fly to Kutaisi, which has a Wizz Air airport, so it's a little bit easier to get there if you're like on a budget, because Wizz Air is a budget airline from Hungary. There's also Batumi, which is the sort of the second city of Georgia, and it sits on the Black Sea, sort of adjacent. Like if you were in Istanbul over here and you just got on a boat, there's Batumi because Georgia is north and east of Turkey. Once you're in Georgia, intercity travel is going to be basically two things. There are old school Soviet trains, which I've never been on one, but I've been on many old school Soviet trains in other countries. And the main factor is that they're very slow. So I'm not sure if I recommend it, but if you have the time, it's a fun way to see any sort of post-Soviet country because the Soviet Union built a lot of infrastructure. Secondarily, and the most way that normal Georgians get around is either by car. So of course you can rent a car. That's a thing you can do. At your own risk. It's in the mountains. People drive really, really crazy in the Caucasus region of the world, so that's up to you. Or you can take a marshutka or a bus. A marshutka is like sort of a minivan And there's these marshutka stations or bus stations. You can hop on a marshutka. You can go to basically sort of any city that you want within, I think, 6 to 8 hours, because Georgia, the country, is not actually very big. And typically the drivers of the marshutkas drive like a bat out of hell. They're really ripping it. So the driving in Georgia, I remember it being extremely sketchy. That was just from my personal opinion. I also had the same feeling in Armenia. I took a drive from Tbilisi to Yerevan, Armenia, and the driver, I mean, maybe it was like a 10-hour drive, but he made it there in 6, and the whole time I thought I was just going to die. So I'm not saying that's going to be your experience, but that's definitely something to remember, and you can plan accordingly. But there is also an internal flight which you can take from Tbilisi to Kutaisi and Kutaisi to Batumi, so you could also do internal flights on different airlines that connect those places. So speaking of extremely dangerous driving, something that I think I never really thought about when I started traveling, but I realized was incredibly important, mostly my mom told me when I was in my early 20s, this is something I needed to have, was travel insurance. And I know it's sort of like a boring component of traveling. It's a thing people don't really think about so much or don't put priority on. But realistically, having lived abroad, things go wrong when you travel. And whether you're on a trip for like 10 days or you're on a long mission like me, maybe 2-3 years, having like an insurance company that you trust and that you feel like understands your situation is really important. And that's why I've actually partnered for this video with a company called Safety Wing, who incidentally, before they offered me the collab, I've actually been using as a user for 3 years since I really started traveling. I would say the one thing about going to regions that are a little bit less traveled, I know Georgia is becoming a little bit more popular, and this is maybe why this video is going to get more views, but in general, whether you're in Paris or whether you're in the countryside of Georgia with a crazy driver, having insurance is really important for the well-being of your trip. And honestly, traveling without insurance is really stupid. The reason for that being is, like, obviously there's situations where something happens, you get into a car accident, you get hurt. Like, that can totally happen, and I think everyone realizes that. The thing is, Nomad Insurance, like Safety Wing, they understand that travel doesn't always go to plan. Maybe your luggage just doesn't show up or goes missing. Maybe you're staying in a hostel and someone just steals your passport. Like, actually for me, I was staying in a hostel in Malaysia, completely unrelated, but I go in and someone stole all of my credit cards. They stole like $150 cash. And I was just like sort of shocked, because this is when I was traveling without insurance. And then the next day I was like, I'm an idiot. I can't believe I put myself in that situation. And that's like a young person mistake, but this is an older version of myself saying, get yourself some insurance. Now, I've looked at a lot of different travel insurance companies, and the reason I went for Safety Wing is because they understand what it means to be a nomad. You can really easily adjust the insurance from anywhere in the world. They have 24-hour customer service, and like you can change your destinations in case your trip isn't necessarily planned. Everything's online, and you even get an online insurance card that you can show and that works with any major claim that you need to make, which is super helpful, because if you just take a standard travel insurance from like one of those large insurance companies, they may not understand what you need. And the thing that's most important is, like, we don't plan for this. And I know a lot of people who traveled, you budget for it, but you don't necessarily have a ton of money to spend, unless you're like big bucks guy. But I was backpacking for a long time. So the Safety Wing also has a $0 deductible. So if something does go wrong and you feel it's worth doing a claim, you can actually make it happen. Luckily, I've been a customer of Safety Wing for 3 years now. I actually haven't had a claim at this point, just because nothing catastrophic has happened. But I'm always glad when I get that bill from Safety Wing reminding me that I am paying for travel insurance, and that if, God forbid, something does happen, I'm covered by people who get what I'm doing, who enjoy the backpacking vibe, who understand the nomadic lifestyle. And it's also good to just give your money to companies that sort of can support you and understand you, instead of just these large corporations which, they don't even know who I am. So I think there's something important with that. So if you're going to travel this summer and you want an insurance company you can trust and that's Nomad verified, feel free to check out my link in the description below. So now is the section where I talk about food. But we're not just going to do food, we're going to talk about the general culture of Georgia and what makes it so special, because many people honestly don't have a lot of exposure to Georgian culture, and I would love to share this amazing country. No one's paying me for this, I just really like Georgian stuff. So here we go. Number 1, the Georgian language. It is one of the world's most unique and interesting languages with its own script and font that is gorgeous. It looks like something out of Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings. It's like medieval elvish stuff. Very interesting language. When you go to Georgia, a lot of the older people will speak Russian because they were in the USSR, although Georgia has pushed and pushed and pushed to de-Russify their country. They don't want anything to do with Russia anymore. It's very clear, politically speaking, and then also just like when you're there, it's very hard to find Cyrillic or anything Russian that's left. That being said, the younger people will not speak Russian. They'll probably speak English as a second language. It seems like when I was there, a lot of people did speak English, and then if they don't speak English or Russian, sort of on your own. Also, since they have this script that you're going to not be able to read, some cafes, some restaurants, some situations, like sometimes when you're trying to find a marshutka, when I was there, they didn't have the English transliteration of the destinations. So you're going to have to ask, well, where is this bus going? Just say it in English, bus, where, destination, Tbilisi, Batumi, and then they'll take you to the right place. That's what I had to do because, I went to the bus station and I couldn't read anything and what are you supposed to do at that point? So secondarily, I want to give a shout out to Georgian music. The music of the Caucasus is so good. It's so fast and spirited and specific. There is some crossover between Armenian music, Azerbaijani music, and the Caucasus Russian music because there are many Russian states or federal republics that are in the Caucasus. They're independent peoples, but they share a lot of sort of history and culture with the Georgian people themselves. The music, it's so cool and so spirited, and I really love it. And what goes with it is if you are in Georgia and you have the opportunity to see Georgian dance is really, really cool. They're very acrobatic, and they have one dance where they dance with swords, and they actually sword fight during the dance, and the swords spark when they're dancing to this very aggressive, very fast-paced Caucasus music. Honestly, one of the coolest things like you'll ever see. I think the thing is with other countries, it's like I don't need to tell you about the culture and music of Colombia because it's very mainstream. I just think with Georgia, you either know or you don't know. So now you know, and now you can go look up Georgian music, Georgian dancing, and now we're going to talk about Georgian food. Georgian food is like one of my top 5 food cultures. It's got influences from everywhere. It got influence from Persian cuisine, got influence from Turkish cuisine, it's got influence from, of course, Russian cuisine. That being said, it is the mecca of Caucasus cuisine. And it's actually interesting, if you ever travel to Eastern Europe, if you ever travel to Russia, if you ever travel to Central Asia, they love Georgian restaurants. There will be as many Georgian restaurants as Italian restaurants because Georgian cuisine is so good. And I think the Western world is starting to pick up on this. And, if you're in New York, you're in Chicago, you're in LA, look up a Georgian restaurant. Try the local cuisine. It is so memorable and really, really addictive. So, some dishes you should be on the look for. Number 1, the sort of national dish of Georgia is khinkali. Khinkali are basically soup dumplings. They're big. They're like bigger than dumplings that you would get at a Chinese restaurant. They're filled with different fillings, definitely meat, sometimes with cheese. There's a very special Georgian type of cheese that is honestly the best. And they're boiled very quickly, and then you have to eat them in a specific way. Don't eat them like a foreigner. Don't cut it into it with a knife. You're supposed to bite the side and turn it because it's hot, and some of the juice sort of settles in there. You're supposed to sip out the juice, and then you can eat the rest of the dumpling. And you leave the top, because the top is like a dough ball, and it actually doesn't cook all the way. So if you see a real Georgian doing it, they'll bite, they'll turn, they'll suck it, they'll eat the rest of it, and they'll leave the top. Khinkali, a Georgian cuisine legend. Next up is anything bread related in Georgia. The bread, the bakeries, they're so good. It's like ridiculous. They do, of course, hachapuri, which is probably the most Instagrammable dish you'll see from Georgia. It's a large baked bread. It's not really a bread. It's more like a bread boat with cheese in the middle and then butter and then eggs on top. Super, super aggressive. I think that's actually called Adjarian hachapuri. There's many types of hachapuri. Hachapuri really is just like stuffed bread. They do it stuffed with meat. They do it stuffed with beans, also very popular, stuffed with different kinds of cheeses. It's just like so good, so rich, so dastardly delicious, and good every time. Like just amazing. Next up, you've got a list of unpronounceable stews, which I'll just say are all really good. If it ends in a vili and starts with a sh, probably something good. Sometimes with beef, They also use a lot of pomegranates and these sort of very specific ingredients that you can get from the Middle East, but not necessarily a Middle Eastern perspective for the cuisine. Always really good. And then the last thing I'll say about the food is the salads. Any type of Georgian salad. Georgian salad features like walnuts and sort of a walnut dressing on a lot of things. Super good. And one of my favorite things is Georgian eggplant rolls, which is sort of like a fried eggplant stuffed with a walnut paste spread, often served with pomegranate. Mind-blowing. The last point about Georgia, and I'll leave it there, is the alcohol is also really good, and the alcohol spirit of Georgia is really lovely. Georgians, the people, are known for making these long, illustrious speeches when you drink with them. And I actually got to see this, and this is one of my favorite stories, which I'll share from Georgia. Two things that you would drink there are wine. The Georgian wine is legendary and delicious. Number two is cha-cha. Cha-cha is something similar to vodka or similar to like schnapps. Depends what they're making it with, but you're going to see it everywhere, and it's also pretty cheap. Local people love it. My little Georgia story is I was on a marshutka from Kutaisi to Tbilisi, which is about 3.5 hours, and there were some other people on the bus with me, and I was having trouble communicating with them. They spoke really basic Russian. I speak really basic Russian, but we weren't really like exchanging a big conversation. We go to a little stop, where the marshutka will stop in the mountains or whatever. They'll refill the fuel. People can get a little bite to eat. So these guys say, brat, 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 in Russian. They say, oh, come over, come over. I'm like, okay. So I follow these guys to the little cafe. And, they're just like really good hosts. They're just like, they clearly want me to eat or share something with them. I'm like, no, it's okay. They're like, no, come. I'm like, okay, davai. I'm like, okay. So I sit down at the table. It's me, 3 men, and a child, probably like 6 years old. Over to the table comes 3 stuffed breads, hachapuri, stuffed with beans or meat, fresh out of the oven, super delicious. And then just maybe half a liter of cha-cha, which it's hard alcohol. It's like 30 or 40 percent, not degrees. It's probably like 80 degrees, 90 degrees. It's strong stuff, hair on your chest sort of stuff. And they're like, we're taking they pour me this longest shot of my life. And we're all sort of doing this thing. And they're all standing, saying something in Georgian. I can't decipher it. And we drink. It's probably a double shot. Take another one, drink. It's another double shot. Eat the bread. They finish the bottle. And then and this kid is just sort of sitting there chilling. And then we walk back to the car. And that's that. Should you be sort of drunk on a Georgian bus with strangers? I mean, probably. That's the way that I like to travel. And those are the experiences that I remember. It doesn't have to be about alcohol. If you don't drink alcohol, it's also fine. But leave yourself open to opportunity. Always follow the locals unless they're maybe trying to kidnap you or something. But other than that, just be open to experiences. And I think that's what Georgia taught me, and it's such a wonderful place. Now let's finish by telling you some good stuff you can do in Georgia. Of course, you can read the blogs online, but these are things that I've crowdsourced, that I've heard from other people, and that I've personally done myself. So when I flew to Georgia, I went to a city called Kutaisi. It's in the middle of the country. It's sort of a former mining town. It's like a nice city. It's worth a couple hours. They have a really beautiful church up on a hill, and it's very majestic looking with a nice little old town. A lot of the towns are influenced by the Ottoman Empire because Georgia was a part of the Ottoman Empire for a really long time. So there's a Turkic style to the buildings, but it is still very, very Georgian and specific. When I went to Georgia originally, I had been watching a lot of Bald and Bankrupt, and if you don't know that channel, it's basically a British guy who goes around and explores old Soviet stuff, and I was really into it. So I was like, I'm going to do some old Soviet stuff, and Georgia has some great things. From Kutaisi, there's actually a city called Tuskaltubo. Very hard to spell, very hard to say, but very interesting city. This city is a city of mansions from the old Soviet regime. Since the Soviet Empire obviously crumbled, the mansions, of course, were abandoned because there was no money for them. And the main mansion in the city was built for Stalin. It's got a massive theater in it. And whatever, all these mansions are just sitting in disrepair. And you can do the most cool urban exploration through these things. Super recommended for a day trip if you want to see weird old Soviet history. The interesting thing about this city is now a lot of people, because Abkhazia is a region northwest in Georgia, and they've had a lot of political issues. They were sort of caught in the fire between the Russian and Georgian wars of the 2008, 2009. And a lot of the refugees from Abkhazia actually ended up living in these mansions in Tuskaltubo. Are they still there? I can't verify that, but they were certainly there when I was there. It's a very tough situation because Georgia is not the richest country in the world, realistically. But it's a really interesting place. And if you want to help out a family while you're there, give them some money. That's also like a great thing to do because those people definitely in need. Also, I went to another city, kind of in striking distance of Kutaisi, called Chiatura. Chiatura has an old Soviet, like, sort of monorail car, because it's also another mining town. There's a lot of mining that used to be done there, but not anymore because the economy has quite changed. Another great place to sort of see a really unique little Soviet-style Georgian town, which has now become just a very Georgian town, because I don't think a lot of foreigners are moving there. So now we're heading east towards Tbilisi, the capital city. There's a city called Gori. Gori is actually home to Stalin originally. Stalin was Georgian. And so there's like a really weird, fascinating memorial to Stalin museum that is just full of Soviet propaganda and that's very, very interesting. So that's also worth a trip. Now, if you want to see normal tourist things that most people see when they go to Georgia, they spend their time between two places. They spend their time in Batumi because it's a beautiful city, the weather's pretty fair, it's on the Black Sea, so you get that sort of beach vibe. It's a good spot. I haven't been to Batumi, but I've heard nothing but good things about Batumi. Is it the most interesting city in Georgia? I don't think it is. The most interesting city in Georgia is probably Tbilisi, the capital city, the place where the most amount of people have come through, and a place that has been changing through a lot recently and historically. They've got this really cool hilltop citadel church complex with really old, really interesting buildings, and it's one of these cities that you can just sort of weave your way through the ancient streets, and it just is so unique and interesting and a blend of cultures. They have some different districts with really good restaurants, hip cafes. It was a city that I really appreciated. It also snows there in the winter, so it's also very beautiful under the snow, very hot under the summer sun. It's a city I really want to go back to. It's on the top of my list of cities that I would like to go back to and investigate more. You could go north to an area called Kazbegi. Kazbegi is really famous for skiing, for hiking and mountaineering. You can do paragliding and skydive. I mean, it's a really amazing place. They also have a lot of monasteries and mountaintop sort of churches, which come from the fact that Georgia is one of the oldest Christian kingdom countries in the world by far. Really, really historic things everywhere you look in Georgia. The last thing, which I also didn't have the chance to do, but which was super recommended, was this area called Vardzia, where some ancient peoples basically built mountaintop cave residences, and you can sort of walk through these old cave residences like they're their homes. It's actually very similar to Cappadocia in Turkey, which has blown up in popularity. You could go be a hipster and go to Vardzia, have a similar experience in a country that is, of course, less traveled. As a final note, I will say, in Georgia, eat the food. Eat as much of it as you can. Drink the wine. Drink as much of it as you can. See some historic sites. You're going to have to go to a couple monasteries, a couple churches. You're going to have to do a day trip to one of these small cities to see those monastery things. Totally worth it. Get into the mountains. Go explore. Go hiking. Get outside. And if you're going to go to Georgia, plan at least 7 days because it's a big country with a lot to see. And it's a place you could spend 2 weeks exploring, and it would totally be enough time. You could even do 3 weeks. And then, realistically, Georgia is not far from many other countries if you want to pop into Azerbaijan, if you want to go to Turkey, East Turkey, if you want to go to Armenia. It's definitely a super great place to go. I hope you guys liked the video. I can't recommend Georgia enough. I'd like to thank the partner of this video, Safety Wing, once again. Stay safe when you travel. It's super important. Make sure to like and subscribe. That's important for me. And I wish you the best of travels in a country that is lesser traveled but is blowing up slowly, so get there as quick as you can. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.